Right. Good afternoon, all of you. I almost have the feeling that we could have a little roundtable discussion intimately without mics and anything. But thanks for coming to this humanitarian talk and to discuss with our panel here one of the many ways in which we can break the silos, work together across mandates and among agencies. And here we have an example of collaboration between the World Food Programme and the UNHCR, which has given results and shown its validity. There could be many more examples. We will go through some of the examples here today. And actually, it's a model that I personally believe could be extended to other agencies with the objective, finally, to target better, to prioritize better in a very concrete way out in the field, so that we manage to translate the commitment that we all made in Istanbul. Some of you may remember some years ago to get to collective outcomes, real results for people in the field, which actually relies very strongly on collaboration among the agencies and the INGOs that are working in this area of humanitarian response. So I would like to hand over, first of all, to David Catchard, who is a good old friend and who plays a very important role in the World Food Programme by fostering resilient responses and supporting communities down there. And obviously, coming from the World Food Programme, I think what is at the forefront of your concerns right now is this humongous food crisis, which well, it has always been there. It has gone a little bit up and down, but with Ukraine and so on, we are really faced with shocks of an unprecedented nature. And I would hope that David can dig into that. And then, of course, also tell us how this hub could provide some kind of help in addressing all of this. And we will hear also from the UNHCR a little bit, from Alia, and from the field, which is very nice. So we have Elizabeth coming in from Mauritania on the screen. The fact that she's not up there, it means that she's just waiting, I suppose. Huh? D'accord, voilà. Very good. So she can listen in as well. But David, over to you, please.
Okay. You can hear me okay. Great. Well, Klaus, thanks so much. And thanks, everyone, for, I know it's a choice along this row here. So thanks for looking into this issue. I think we'll have a lot of interesting insights that are very useful for you. What I've been asked to do, so I'm the director of program at WFP, just flew in just now, so I'm even getting oriented here, is just give a bit of context of what we're facing. I was interested to hear how Klaus was going to frame it, because we don't have a term for it. We're beyond the perfect storm. We're beyond biblical proportions. We are just really in a new normal of global food crisis, for lack of a better term. And it's also a bit therapeutic to speak about it, because it is really demanding on all of us as we speak. So I'll give a little, it won't do justice to it, but just a little bit of an overview, and then how the hub, from our perspective, fits within that. And then we'll get to some real insights of how this is working. So we were concerned even before these waves of global crisis, COVID and this global crisis we went through last year coming from the war in Ukraine. Even before that, we had rising food prices, we had rising food insecurity, we were behind on SDG 2. That only was aggravated by the waves of COVID and the global food crisis last year, with incredible food price spikes that we saw last year. This is being discussed, I'm sure, in many fora here, but the drivers, of course, are not unknown to you. conflict. And conflict is, unfortunately, continuing to expand from central Sahel to the coastal areas, from northeastern Nigeria to central and south, South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, even the gangs in Haiti are all aggravating a food insecurity situation in those countries I just mentioned that now have famine threats. So as we sit here today, WFP is estimating about 350 million people are in acute food insecurity, up 200 from where it was in 2019, and 43 million or so are really on the verge of famine in those countries I just mentioned, for example. Now, on the other driver is, of course, the climate crisis, which doesn't wane. And there we've been through successive La Nina, and we now have the prospects of El Nino, so it may get even more aggravated and even worse. And what we saw last year was really the economic layer. So we have the drivers of conflict, climate crisis, well known. Now we have an economic layer. This was high prices of food, fuel, fertilizer, so inputs for agricultural production were also spiking, as well as food prices, particularly last year. They remain high. Some stabilization has happened, but we now have chronic debt, currency fluctuations, domestic inflation, all of which conspire to make household food insecurity a real concern. So when you come from the view of the household, which is what we do with our surveying, it's gotten much, much worse, despite some of the global headlines that prices are going down or stabilizing and so on. And that's how we reach this state of 350 million in dire straits in terms of acute food insecurity. Now, the other theme that is going on, no doubt, in all the rooms here is, of course, that we have skyrocketing needs, but limited or leveling resources, and I would add capability of humanitarian actors to respond to that. So we have a delta, and it's growing, and it's of great concern to agencies like ourselves. Just taking the WFP example, last year, the minimum we had said on a needs-based budget was $22 billion were required to address what we knew of as the acute food insecurity needs. This year, we're talking $24 billion, but these almost become a fantasy because what WFP brought in was $14 billion with great effort, historic high and everything last year, and this year we're expecting 10 to 11 billion. So you can do the math and know that we have a dire situation ahead of us. Sadly, we project this is not just for 2023. Many more are talking now that this will spill into 2024. Now, this is the context within which we're working. And what we've done in response to this, and this might also be a theme coming out in many of the other sessions, is the humanitarians are dealing with a fairly limited pie. We're trying to grow that pie with some IFI or private sector and so on, but it's limited how much that can grow. So we're looking at the pie itself and seeing how we can be more efficient. So there's a lot more investment on efficiencies, common services, the use of cash or different modalities to, in our case, deliver food, and the agility to go between one modality to another. We've got a much more sophisticated toolbox for intervening, for example, and there's some efficiencies built in there. We also have the issue of anticipatory action. With many of these emergencies, the faster you act at the early action phase, the more you save downrange in terms of costs. So all of that is being invested in, and probably to a maximum to a certain degree. A big area of work that was intensified last year and continues on, and this now brings us closer and closer to the hub, is the issue of targeting. We're doing much more intensive targeting and prioritization. And this is kind of in continual loops of this kind of work as we try to again, maximize efficiency in responding with the limited resources and an overwhelming need. Now, an approach that WFP has taken that when we were in Geneva a few days ago, all of us together in a high-level consultation with HCR, is we are breaking things down a bit. So we're trying to meet need, the most urgent need, But we know if that's all we do, it's just going to get worse. So there's also a significant amount of work going on shifting need. So shifting certain caseloads to national social protection systems or other systems. And then there's the continual aspiration to reduce need through understanding root causes and then addressing them. So meet, shift, reduce need is very much part of the approach also that evolved last year, and some more sophistication has come into play. Now, Klaus, if I may now situate the hub in this, if you don't mind. So very quickly on that to give a bit of a chapeau. So WFP and HCR have had a long-standing partnership. In fact, in my career, I grew up with that partnership. It's been a model in the UN system. We just had, as I say, our high-level consultation a few days ago, which we do regularly. We have an MOU, of course, but we really keep it live with those consultations. And we discuss these issues of overwhelming need, efficiencies, meet, shift, reduce need, these type of things. And within that partnership, the value of a joint facility that can do joint assessments and really work on joint programming options as well as targeting is quite valued and has given very good support from the two managements, WP and HCR, and that is, of course, the hub that we'll be focusing in on today. And so the hub reflects WFP's commitment in this era we're in right now to have evidence-based, context-specific, well-targeted program interventions that are not static, as I said earlier, that continue to be reassessed. And we need a facility that can really deliver on that. Now, the hub has been working for a few years. You'll probably get a bit more insight in a few minutes, and it's key to this approach. And since inception, I was just getting briefed, and I'm very pleased to see that around 15 joint assessments in some 9 countries were carried out with joint expertise drawn from both WFP and HCR. And these assessments go on for a while. They're not just a quick in and out, so they do really mean something. And on the meet, shift, reduce needs, let me give you 3 examples. So in Uganda, the hub facilitated a consultation with those affected, the refugee communities that were going to be affected by really strict pipeline cuts and issues, and a joint prioritization was facilitated through the hub's intervention in Uganda to facilitate meeting needs in that refugee context. In the case of Mali and Mauritania, and you're going to get a lot more detail, but I just want to flag that this is really getting a lot of attention now. So the Malian refugees in Mauritania were brought into the national social protection system in Mauritania itself. This is a big plus. It's not, we've gone ages of care and maintenance type of operations in those refugee camps, and now we have this new way of working, again, shifting need or sharing the burden with national systems in effect. And finally, in Mozambique, we have a good example where the hub has worked with, and informed for WFP and HCR teams on how we can bring more self-reliance to refugee communities there. And we've agreed last week to invest more in Mauritania, Mozambique, other places like Burundi and Jordan in terms of these new type of approaches. The hub plays this very important target and prioritization role, which you will hear. But I want to add one last dimension, Klaus, and then I know you want me to finish up, is that as the hub wrestles with things on the ground in these very complex scenarios where these vulnerable populations are facing multidimensional risk environments, very complicated to understand, and the coping mechanisms and all of it happening in very compressed timeframes, there's lessons that we're learning in terms of community participation, accountability to affected populations, targeting, the science of targeting, assessments and so on, and program options. Capturing those lessons, deriving best practice, helping replicate best practice is a knowledge function, a knowledge management function. And so as we think now of the next phase of the hub, one thing WFP will be doing is looking with HCR at how we can maximize this, because knowledge is also at a premium and doesn't always get a systematic attention in our humanitarian community. So maybe I better wrap up there, Klaus. Sorry, you ran the risk of giving me the floor and giving me a mic.
No, but I think it was important to get the bigger picture, and it's actually scary, the picture you you painted for us, that needs are just exploding, and it's exploding in a way I have never remembered before. I mean, we all remember Biafra and so on, but that was before I was active in this field. But recently, this is a real catastrophe. And of course, money is coming in, but there's not enough. So we have to target and be much more specific, because the worst thing we want to do is to give it to some people that then actually don't need it, because et cetera, et cetera. So Alia from UNHCR, you are in this partnership with David, and how do you see it from your side? And I must say, I'm really glad that you're both here on these high stools, because I remember talking about collaboration between UNHCR and the World Food Programme in South Sudan, and it was not easy. I can tell you, it was not easy. It was not a civil war, but it was some tough decisions, and then I see you here. So it's very comforting. How do you see it?
Thank you very much. It's working. Good. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Klaus, for having us here today. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here and to contribute to this important discussion. I think you're right. We have come a long way. I think it's fair to say that we have evolved a lot in our relationship. It is a long-standing one, as you mentioned, David. We're present together on the ground. We've responded to many a great emergency and a complex emergency together, and we continue to provide assistance and protection to many populations that are also now in protracted situations, many years later, without a solution. And of course, this experience has contributed to the evolution of the partnership as it stands today. I think it's true that the current situation, as David has outlined so well, and here I would perhaps highlight one more dimension, and that is that the situation is, of course, compounded by the 100 million plus displaced people that we have today around the world, and that food crises are also, in essence, protection crises. If we look at the protection implications that food insecurity can have on populations that are experiencing this food insecurity in terms of what we describe as harmful coping mechanisms, children dropping out of school, children becoming more susceptible to high risks of neglect, of abuse, exploitation as they are exposed to labor early in their lives as a way of meeting basic needs. So I think when we look at the current situation, the current really dire global situation, and compound that with the protection dimension, I think we realize one thing: protection crises require a multi-sectoral response, and they require a response that is also multi-stakeholder. And that in itself, I think, defines how we operate, whether it's us bilaterally, how closely we are working together, or how we work with others and how we bring other partners into the picture. So it is, in a way, perhaps a new way of working for us that really leverages our capacities, our efficiencies, has been mentioned already, and really ensures also that we're reducing and hopefully entirely eliminating any form of duplication in our work. I see a lot of growth in our partnership really happening organically at field level amongst country teams and regional teams. And in our recent discussion this week in Geneva, we were able to highlight a couple of these teams, in particular in the Middle East, North Africa region, but we have examples elsewhere, also in East Africa and elsewhere. So that's also a very encouraging development. I'm proud, and I think we can all be proud, that the organizations had the foresight back in 2020 to establish the Joint Targeting and Program Excellence Hub. I think it's served us well to have had that facility, that structure, that collaboration in place as we deal with really a deteriorating food security situation and increased needs. Jane will describe the hub in more detail, but perhaps she'll be too humble to describe how it's set up. This is an interagency team of excellent staffers, both UNHCR and WFP staffers, with a wide range of expertise. technical expertise, but also a very astute team that is visionary and that really has the capacity to take forward our joint organization's vision and works on targeting and joint assessments and other good work. How is this critical to our partnership? It's really the evidence base and the data that is generated as a result of the hub's work. This evidence base is what we use, as has been described, to target, to prioritize, and I would say with good quality data, with sound quality data that is granular, and I think that's what the hub is giving us, that granularity of understanding the needs and the vulnerabilities amongst the population. We are really better able to support the population, not only in a prioritized way, but in a differentiated way as well. Our support is more differentiated than it has been in the past. What I mean by that is there is a segment within the population that is so vulnerable that will require immediate food assistance, basic needs assistance. There are segments within the population that perhaps are at a level where they would benefit from interventions and investments that offer them livelihoods opportunities. And we're therefore also jointly able, as we target, to also offer increasingly opportunities for displaced populations to get on the pathway, at least if I can acknowledge that it's a progressive process, to get on the pathway towards self-reliance and moving away from dependency. So that's very exciting for us, that we're able to leverage these capacities that we jointly have and build on the capacity of the hub to move in that direction. We use the same data, again, to invest or to work closely on matters related to inclusion, the inclusion agenda. David has mentioned really the ambition that we have to gradually, again, it's progressive, it's responsible, it has to be that way, a process of shifting some of the needs and transitioning some populations into strong government-led social protection systems. And I emphasize they have to be strong, they have to be robust, they have to be resilient, they have to be shock responsive, as we call them in the world of social protection, because only if they have those ingredients is it, of course, feasible to then have an inclusive, equitable approach that also allows for the inclusion of displaced populations, refugees in any given context. So the same data, the same evidence is something we're also able to leverage. If we're using it to its maximum value and really exploiting the data we have, then we're also using it towards advocacy with host governments, with donors, with development actors to achieve that level of inclusion. There's another dimension, but I think I'll let Jane speak first, on the sort of economic opportunity, livelihood side. Would you like me to go into that now, or should we move to Jane?
I think it would be nice to hear a little bit about it, because...
Thank you. Yeah. Sure, no, with pleasure. Yeah, I think it's...
I'm actually fascinated by the fact that you say that you can have an area, and you have people that are really in a very shitty situation, and they are offered, and then they transition out, and you differentiate the assistance, and you save a bit of money so that more can be helped of those that are really having problems, because this is a way to get more bang for the bucks. I mean, in a situation where the resource constraint is so patent. But on the livelihoods thing.
Thank you,
yeah.
Absolutely. No, absolutely, and I think that's our shared goal, right? Our goal, WFP and HCR's goal, is to address immediate and acute needs now, but of course, our ultimate goal is to get people onto a pathway to self-reliance. That certainly that is the ultimate. That's where we're all really heading. And the sooner we're able to introduce that into our programming, the more we're able to front load that into our programming and to benefit from targeting information that we have now. Hopefully, the more successful we can be at this. Another dimension around economic inclusion, if we say the economic component of socioeconomic inclusion, of course, is access to labor markets. Again, this is something that can only work multi-sectorally. We need the private sector for this. We need IFIs, development investment, development actor investment. And it is also somewhat linked to the work we do on social protection. I think where we have the most promising prospects of inclusion are probably in the locations where UNHCR has been working very closely with IFIs, in particular with the World Bank. I'm thinking of countries where we have strong World Bank investment that we've been able to collaboratively design with the bank, so it is targeted at refugee hosting areas within the country. So those are the IDA 18, IDA 19, now the IDA 20 commitment. Countries where we have that relationship already and that sort of integration of displacement into development work, and where WFP is already working on system strengthening. That's probably the convergence of capacities, efficiencies that we can bring to certain countries' situations where perhaps there is scope then to progressively, and to make the business case, right? At the end of the day, again, this data that we're able to get through the hub, and my colleague Elizabeth Eister in Mauritania can speak to that in more detail, because that was essentially the Mauritanian experience. We can use this data to make a business case to governments and to donors, or what we call an incentive package, right? That sort of would encourage the possibility of ultimately including displaced populations in national systems. Again, on the premise, on the prerequisite that they are robust and strong and receive multi-year, predictable and sustainable support. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
That's great. Have I seen a little bit of flicker, of optimistic flicker in the middle of this awful problem we have, that governments, they actually listen to the positive sum game story, that if you give them work permits and you allow them to integrate and have economic activities, it will actually be better for you. It's something that I could tell my own government in Denmark, that they should give more work permits. I'm very upset about that, but is it moving a little bit in the right direction?
I mean, we have to be hopeful and optimistic, but I think certainly costing inclusion versus costing exclusion is, for example, also a new discourse now that we're increasingly investing in, right? What is the cost of inclusion versus the cost of not including? I think we have a responsibility also to showcase and give more visibility to examples population-specific or area-specific where refugees, displaced populations are able to contribute to the local economy informally or formally. I think those are perhaps some of the challenges that we have ahead to again, have access to that data, to these stories, and support giving them the right showcase and the right visibility. But I think that does and can resonate. Again, there are many factors that need to be lined up in place, right? And resourcing is one, financing is one, and of course there are political dimensions to these decisions. But evidence, credible evidence that is compelling, goes a long way, I think, to make some of these really socioeconomically grounded business cases to present to governments.
I mean, being an old statistician, I know that having good numbers is rather convincing, even in a politically infected discussion. If you can prove something, then there's a listening ear somewhere. So let's be optimistic. Would it be time to maybe hear a story from Elizabeth, who sits in Nouakchott? Or Elizabeth, are you back on the screen? Would you be able? Yes. Have you been able to listen to the presentations a little bit?
Yes, I have. I have to admit that it was a bit patchy at the beginning. I will try to remain calm because I was a bit frazzled trying to connect. But I really appreciate being invited to this event. Just so everyone knows, I know introductions were made, but because I missed a bit at the beginning. I'm the representative for UNHCR in Mauritania. My name's Elizabeth Eister. And before joining this event, I touched base with the WFP rep, Kainde Samba, who was also involved in this exercise. And I like what I'm hearing about the optimism, because I think if you take an example of Mauritania, it is one where you have permission to be optimistic, because the starting point of this exercise was one of inclusion, a policy of inclusion taken by the government, because there were 4 parties involved in the use of the Joint Targeting Hub, UNHCR, WFP, the Hub, and the Social Registry of Mauritania, because they had taken the bold decision to include refugees in the Social Registry. But they needed a methodology to enroll the refugees in the Social Registry. So this is where the Targeting Hub came in. Just to give everyone the context, Mauritania has hosted Malian refugees for several decades. But in this instance, we're talking about a camp that was created in 2012 when the violence, can you hear me okay? Yeah?
It's perfect.
Yeah, when we had renewed violence in Mali, a bit what we're seeing today, was in 2012, and the camp was created, Membera Camp. We reached a point 9 years after running this camp together with the refugees and the government, where the government was ready to pursue a policy of inclusion. And we had an assistance program that was blanket assistance. So obviously there was an interest on both on behalf of the humanitarians and as well the government to do a targeting exercise. So that's a bit of the context. And then at that time, the population of Membera Camp was around 68,000 people. Unfortunately, today it's reached 83,000 people. So as you see, it's a camp that continues to receive refugees, but the policy of inclusion of the government continues. The targeting hub was very important for this operation, and I speak on behalf of UNHCR and WFP, but also other stakeholders, because we didn't have the in-house expertise at local level. I think it's really important that we invest in these types of hubs of excellence, because operations shouldn't be asked to reinvent the wheel, and we should be aspiring to excellence when we undertake activities like this, when we've been in existence for as long as we have. And having access to a hub, to a methodology, and to experts was essential. And that allowed us to go forward, and also to go forward as well with an external party, even though it was WFP and UNHCR targeting hub. I think for the refugees themselves to see the level of expertise being brought in was very important as well for their engagement, because it wasn't homegrown. It didn't have that risk of bias, but it really looked like a thorough methodology. And as just to remind everyone, it was something that was implemented not by UNHCR and WFP on the ground. The hub brought the methodology, but the manpower for the exercise and the woman power was the social protection of Mauritania. So they actually implemented the exercise. So already, to get to the point made at the very start of the workshop before I lost connection, bringing the expertise, working together, not working in silos, but working together as partners in the UN system, but also with the government. This was achieved through this exercise. So the in-house expertise and the outside expertise. The second really important element of this exercise was the amount of investment and time put into engaging with the refugees. So the part of the methodology was really communication, accountability, engaging the refugees. This was essential because we know this, it's classic everywhere in the world that you start to do a re-registration, a verification exercise of your refugee population, you're going to get pushback, you're going to get resistance. So the efforts made to engage the refugees were fundamental and very well done, because today the refugees are accepting the results. There are still issues, there are still challenges, those will remain, but I would say by and large, I've made now 10 visits to the camp, and I feel that there's acceptance for the results. Again, it's not perfect, we have to continue communicating, and right now the big concern is that we continue to receive new arrivals, how will they be included, etc. But there is acceptance. And in fact, we've moved beyond just acceptance to almost an appreciation of the results, in the sense that you have 14,000 households were included in the survey. The result of the targeting was 53% of the population has been identified as extremely vulnerable. That's a huge percentage of the population, 53%. 43% are vulnerable, which is also a significant number, which leaves you with only 4% that are less vulnerable, that have more of the means to be self-reliant. That 4% is a 4% that can contribute to the development of the camp, the development of the region where the camp is located, Membera, Basikuno, on the border with Mali. That population, that 4%, was able to receive cash grants of a different nature to help start small businesses, to get themselves self-reliant, but also in a position to employ other refugees in the camp. It set an example. So the refugees are now also seeing the benefits of self-reliance. It's not just theory, self-reliance, it's a reality, because they see those who are self-reliant, who've been given the support because they were in the group that was identified as less vulnerable. And you see more and more refugees wanting to pass into that group. And this is where we now need to focus our attention. And it was said also at the beginning, I wrote it down, but I don't know if I can find it, but to pass from need to more self-reliance. I'm sorry, apologies, because I liked the beautiful words that I heard, but it's part of our methodology now. It's part of our philosophy to really pass to resilience. You're welcome to take the floor now and repeat those words that you said before. But this is the mantra in.
I don't remember what I said, but I'm sure it was extremely clever.
Yes, yes.
I'm sure about that. But it is about self-reliance and graduating out.
Yes, so it was meet, shift, and reduce need.
Yeah, meet, shift.
That's
That was David.
Yeah, meet, shift,
Yeah.
reduce.
Yeah.
Meet, shift, and reduce need. And this is what the targeting exercise has allowed us to do, that shift. But it doesn't mean to disengage. It doesn't mean necessarily that we're saving money just for the sake of saving money. As you said, we can focus more on group 1, the extremely vulnerable, but we also need to give attention to group 2 that wants to move to group 3, which is less vulnerable, by providing the means for resilience. That's vocational training. That's seed money to start small businesses. That's the concept of the graduation model. That's savings and loan concepts. That's financial inclusion. Those are big investments that we need to make now before those in group 2 fall into group 1, which is extremely vulnerable. Am I still connected to the conference?
Yes, yes, and we enjoy what you're saying.
Okay, because I didn't see you there for a while. Okay, then I'll get on to my very last point, which is the data. We now have a rich data set. Just to remind everyone, we followed all the data protection policies. We negotiated hard with the social registry. They are now the owners of the data. They own the data. It's not owned by UNHCR and WFP. It is owned by the government of Mauritania, the social registry. But it is also data that we are analyzing and making available to other partners, because this data isn't just about food assistance. It's about the whole approach we're taking to the camp and to the refugee situation in Mauritania. If we want to pursue a policy of inclusion, we need that data. We need to know what is the socioeconomic profile of the refugee, what are their capabilities. That sits in the data. So we've invested a lot of time analyzing the data, we have it on our micro data library for those that are interested to access it. And we're also making it available through our own analysis and sharing with partners. So we're putting it at the disposition of other partners so that we can all be working towards the famous nexus, the humanitarian development peace nexus, which needs data, which needs knowledge, which needs expertise in order to move ahead. And this, the hub certainly contributed to moving us forward in the nexus. So I'll just end there.
Wow, I think we have to give her a hand. This is fantastic. No, I mean, we came from blanket delivery without distinction, and now we come to a very sophisticated process of meet, shift, reduce needs, and self-reliance. This is very, very good news. I have one question for you, Elisabeth. What about the host communities? I mean, how is that? Is that all linked up? And by the way, I want to pay tribute also to the learning process with the local people, the social security administrators, that they have gobbled it up. They have sort of they have taken ownership. This is very interesting. But what about the host communities?
Yeah, so the ones to implement the targeting, that was the social registry. And the social registry were also the beneficiaries, if you will, of the methodology that came from the targeting hub and learned in the process and have refined their own methodology, because there's these household surveys that they're doing with their own population as well. So it has helped refine the methodology for household servicing, and that they will feed back to you positively. The impact on host communities is now you are putting refugees more on par with host communities. You've enrolled them in the social registry, just like the host community. We haven't reached total parity yet. Refugees are still receiving assistance. The host community doesn't receive assistance. And that's why I put this emphasis on resilience, that we really need to invest in vocational training, in micro projects, in activities that can build the resilience of the refugee population, and at the same time do it with the host community. Now we do not only exclusively talk about refugees, we talk about refugees and host communities. If we look at vocational training, which we have, it is vocational training for refugees and host communities. And hopefully we will start to have a rich data set on the host communities as we do on the refugees, because the social registry will continue with its household surveys. It's not planned for this year, but it's planned for next year. And with World Bank help, it may be brought forward to be this year.
Wow, that's great, because we have to be very attentive to potential tensions between the refugee or the displaced population and the host communities. And I can hear from what you're saying that this is very strongly on your radar screen, and it's actually part of the process. Very, very welcome. Right, we may come back to you, Elisabeth, so stay on board, but I'm turning now to Jane, because you have played a little role in all of this, haven't you, with some of your collaborators. Could you take us through how it helps us really targeting what are the techniques, and how you see also the future of the hub? Can it fly by itself, or does it need fuel?
Very good question, Klaus. Thank you. I'm Jane. I'm the coordinator of the Joint Hub. And just to echo Alia, I am just representing what is a really excellent team of technicians, but I would say also humanitarian diplomats who are able to bring WFP and UNHCR operations together at field level and to negotiate deals. We've talked about it earlier. It's not always easy to have two mandated agencies to understand the context the same way. WFP is coming from a food security angle, obviously UNHCR is coming from a protection angle, and how do you marry those visions, which are complementary but sometimes at odds, to make sure that you have a joint understanding of a context and then can lead to decisions about targeting, prioritization, joint programming, inclusion that Elisabeth helped us understand earlier. So I tend to agree with you, Klaus. I think the model is quite exciting because I can't think of another model like this that exists. We are a remote team, which means that we're not linked to Rome or Geneva directly. We report to WFP and to UNHCR equally. We have two hats. We introduce ourselves as being neutral and independent to the conversation, and we really try and focus on outcomes for people. And I'm glad that Elisabeth mentioned it. It's not just about the data. The data is important. We need to understand vulnerabilities. We need to understand needs, because we can provide differentiated assistance to people. Blanket assistance is a regressive tax against the most vulnerable. That's how I like to think about it. So if you're able to identify the people who need it the most, then let's make sure that we get them the package that they need, and so that we, with these limited resources, we're able to do the right thing. Targeting is not about saving money, it's about excellence in programming. It's about making sure that the right people get the right stuff at the right time. And I think this is an important message, because I think there's quite a push to target and prioritize because the pie is as small as it is. But we're seeing that wherever we're able to facilitate targeting and prioritization, the needs don't go away. The needs are still there, it's just that we have a better understanding of them, and hopefully we can leverage these linkages to development actors, to governments, to the IFIs and others, and start sharing that burden of responsibility, which UN operational agencies, year after year, have to shoulder. And this is a reality, right? UNHCR and WFP are always there. Unfortunately, in a lot of contexts where we work, we don't see many others. And this is an opportunity to bring those others into the conversation and to give them some solutions, as opposed to just a problem, which is that we have refugees and we don't know what to do with them. So we're seeing some real progress in terms of the data bringing something to the table, but we've also discovered that accountability to affected populations, and I don't mean to sound naive here, is not just a tick the box exercise about being good to people, about communicating. They have helped us fine-tune the targeting approaches and the prioritization approaches that we propose, because they'll come back to us and say, actually, you're not right, the data wasn't quite right about this eligibility criteria, or we see vulnerability differently, have you considered this, that, and the other thing? So we're having conversations with communities about what is the right thing to do, which then generates this buy-in that Elizabeth is talking about. Again, it's not perfect. We're muddling through, we're trying to understand how to do this, but we're seeing that sincere engagement with communities over time through an iterative process has been incredibly helpful. And so I'll speak to just one example, if I may. We've been working in Rwanda for 2.5 years, almost 3 years now. One of the first countries where the Joint Hub was asked to support. And the idea there, I think there's about 130 refugees across 6 different camps. The environment is quite progressive. The government of Rwanda lets refugees work. They have freedom of movement. There's some work towards financial inclusion. But there are still very high levels of vulnerability. WFP, UNHCR, the government, roughly at around the same time, start to think about the fact that they can provide differentiated assistance, that refugees are vulnerable, but they're not all the same. They're not all equal. And treating them as if they're all the same is actually, again, a regressive tax against the most vulnerable, right? So how can we pool our resources, pool our expertise, take Alia's protection hat, David's food security hat, and start to really grapple with what do we do with limited resources? At the same time, lo and behold, we have a huge resource crunch on the WFP side, so a targeting exercise becomes a prioritization exercise overnight. So what do you do with this limited pot of funding? We were able to identify the different vulnerability groups, so the highly vulnerable, the moderately vulnerable, the less vulnerable, and then you start to play around with what you can do in terms of rations, right? So just to say that there are ways to do this. It's resource intensive. It takes a lot of man hours to get there. But we have the tools and we have the skill sets to be able to do it. And to get back to what you were saying earlier, David, one thing that we've committed to is to make sure that all of this is in the public domain. So all of our data sets, all of the assessments, everything, our learning activities, learning reviews, because we go in and we interview everybody after the fact to see what we did wrong, to see who we've offended, and we've documented and it's all available publicly. And the idea really is to have this be a public good, because I tend to agree with you, Klaus. I think this could be a model for UN collaboration. Not that you would always need a facility, but conceptually, we have great aspirations of collaboration and doing things, but how do you do it is the nut that we're still trying to crack. And the hub, through very, brighter people than me sitting in Rome and Geneva who dreamed up of this idea, is quite progressive in that way, because it's really getting their hands dirty. We're not policy wonks sitting in HQ. We're operational people who are providing direct support to country offices. Whether they like us or not is something different, but we try to do our best. Thanks, Klaus.
No, that's very interesting. I mean, obviously we all speak about accountability to affected populations, but me being an old donor, I was just wondering if this message of better targeting and actually creating reliance would be highly motivating for donors to come in and support this kind of programs, because it's not blanket, like we just give aid all over the place. No, you know what you're doing, and the donor can see that it gives maybe some hope, some optimism that we were. I don't know if donors have reacted to this thing.
I mean, from my perspective, I think that the donors have been asking for better targeting for over a decade, right? So I think it responds to a donor request that's been long-standing. I think it's difficult to do, and so I think it's important to know how to do it, not to do any harm. We've seen in 2 cases, in Rwanda and in Zambia, where WFP was facing food cuts, when we were able to come up with the data and show a targeting or prioritization approach, the donors came back and increased funding for WFP. Because they were convinced. They said, okay, this isn't just about cutting rations across the board. We have the data, the community has been engaged, it's been an entire process. WFP and UNHCR are coming to us and asking for help. They've come to the table. The question is, will the other donors on the other side of the house, our development friends, the INPAs of this world, the USAIDs of this world, will they also come to the table and start picking up some of the longer term development requirements that we have? And this is what I would personally like to see.
Yeah, but it gives them a hook. Yeah. They have an entry point. If they pick up at the end of this reducing the need thing, then they could hook in, then they need to look at their national development plan and etc. It's really interesting. I don't know if any of you would want to comment. You have been taking a hell of a lot of notes, David, so maybe there's something burning. Or Alia?
Yeah, perhaps I could just come in on that last point. I mentioned earlier, and you stressed that, and I think Elizabeth made the example as well of differentiated approaches, right? That if we have the right evidence base and the right data that is so granular that we are really able to let's say, map out the population into a welfare population, a population that could be put on a pathway to a self-reliance. I think that optimum use of data is another advantage that we have in attracting donor interest, whether it's governments or development partners. And I just wanted to give another example that we haven't mentioned, which is very exciting as well, in the spirit of the optimism, Klaus, that you pointed out to earlier. In Jordan, for example, we've taken, and I think there's potential there to leverage the hub as well. This is something that the 2 operations are pursuing, but the hub could bring in expertise towards that. Data is being collected and analyzed for targeting purposes, but it is there to identify needs, to identify vulnerabilities, and the layer that we've added in Jordan is to also identify capacities within the refugee population. So the 2 operations are currently working on a mapping of capacities and skill sets amongst the Syrian refugee population. This will be extended also to other nationalities. This data set will also be available now and complement the data we have on vulnerability, on needs, and eventually this can then be shared, reinvested with potential employers, prospective employers, and to really secure livelihoods opportunities for those groups. So I say this as an example of really where this focus on targeting for the purpose of providing assistance, this focus on prioritization where there is a huge gap between needs and resources available can also be used, that same methodology can also be extended to also map out capacities and then really take it to the other level of really pathways towards self-reliance.
It's very interesting when we think in terms of scaling up. I mean, here we are talking about 68,000, but I mean, we got numbers before that were just catastrophic. But to scale it up, is that an option? I don't know. But David, I can see your body language. You're moving. That means that you have something burning inside. I also see Robert Piper behind. Yeah. Could this be applied? Could this be applied in the Philippines or Mindanao? Think about it, and I'll come back to you.
That's what's making us nervous. He's in the house. No, it's good he's here. Now, just a few things to add that I think are coming out, but really to emphasize them. the issue of advocacy and joint advocacy is quite powerful. We always think of our operations requiring resources and staff type of inputs and so on. But there's actually, and this is something that HCR and WFP are teaming up on, as we have these good stories now, like the inclusion in Mauritania, we can start to point to a best case that then we could make an argument in another context, fueled by data, but joined with the World Bank or the African Development Bank, adding voices to the natural advocates that governments would expect, HCR advocating for protection and WFP and food security. But joining up, I think there's tremendous potential from the advocacy track, and we need to do more of it, but you can only do it when you have solid evidence along the lines that Jane's been describing. On the global public good, that is an aspiration of our Secretary General, and we're going to have more and more discussions about, because the UN sits on a lot of data and tools and techniques and so forth. And so slowly but surely, it is coming out from agencies that are normally pretty proprietary about all that to contribute. And the hub becomes one of those avenues to contributing a global public good. So I'm so pleased that Jane mentioned that, because I'm involved in those type of discussions in other parts of WFP where we're prying things loose to make them global public goods. You've heard about this hunger map, for example, trying to see if maybe that could be such a thing. Now, the other point I wanted to make was the issue of the informal sector. This is, it's understudied, I'm guessing, but my sense is it's understudied, and we could do so much more there, understanding it and then adding that to our advocacy efforts with governments. Why inclusion? Because these are these are cities oftentimes, vibrant cities that are actually contributing something, and there are, more and more partnerships that, like we have in WFP, where we're looking at the full economic extent of what we're doing when we intervene on a humanitarian basis, whether it's buying food and so forth. And so we might want to take some of those type of techniques and look at that as well. And that gets me to my final point at this point, is the issue of cross-pollination. So we're learning something in this refugee sector, when the hub is really moving that along, and I think we've got that point across about knowledge management, capturing best practices, and so on. We have a facility that can do that for us in future. But as we do learn some things in the refugee sector, there's also things we're learning as we respond to IDPs, and as we've been through COVID and the food crisis, and we're learning quickly now because we have a different way of working. So for example, some of our cash distribution at WFP is now intended to have a financial inclusion linked to women's empowerment. As we do humanitarian cash, we actually go after that outcome, and we're doing that better now, more and more now, and we're feeling more comfortable in doing that. When we go and have to provide food, because we still do food too, we now have the majority of our food is locally and regionally purchased in the world. That was never the case before, by the way, with WFP. We turned that quarter last year, and as we do that, and we do that sometimes on contracts with governments, we insist that a large portion comes from small holders, so that their improvement comes through that process, and also they don't become caseloads of the future, because they're a very vulnerable group in and of themselves. So we call this changing lives to save lives. This is the term we've coined for this, and we've learned a lot last year that we're just going through, but some of the things we might have learned in those areas could be transferred to the refugee responses or the IDP responses, and vice versa. So I do think there needs to be a bit more of that kind of cross-pollination also. And so I'm quite excited, and I have, as you can detect, a bit of optimism about how things are going and things we can take forward. And maybe just on that track, and I'll finish up, is the scaling. This is the problem. We have best practice or good enough practice. Now we're really promoting good enough practice, because we don't need 5 years of studies sometimes to know that this is working. And we're so desperate now with the situation that if we can collectively say something is good enough, or even a documented best practice, we have the issue of scaling. This is the wall that we have for so many of these emerging best practices, how indeed to scale them. Scaling has to do with national resources, IFIs. It gets back back to advocacy, where you have well-documented pilots or small-scale efforts that then everybody agrees that's the way to go, and then you advocate and hopefully get, because a WFP, an HCR alone, we are not sustainable funding over time. We're not big enough because most of these things are done by national budgets and IFIs at scale, so it's a matter, there's that challenge out there as well that we need to be aware of.
It's immensely interesting. Also, because what I hear is humanitarian funding going in and actually producing development outcomes. It's amazing. I mean, waiting for the development guys to come because we want them in, and that's why I think also, Jane, to have the World Bank into this operation is important. We have to get these actors on board and make sure we all pull in the same direction. So this was actually, I see some flicker of optimistic light here. I don't know how you feel it in the audience. It's rather innovative. It's interesting. It's small scale, but if we can then scale it up. Robert, do you have anything to add on this? Can you copy it in the Philippines or Mamar? Hello?
I have a question.
Yes? Do you want the mic? No. Yeah. Voila.
Hello. Thank you very much. My name is Mamar Mezuk. I work also for the WFP. First of all, really congratulations, and I think I join Klaus since to the work that you actually carried out. I imagine how much effort, as you said, Jane. But from my own experience, working in different contexts, such initiatives rely heavily on personal contacts, on relationship on the ground to make them work. You know how it changes. My question then is, how could such initiatives, which are really in the best interest, first of all, of the beneficiaries, and then of efficiency, as you all outlined that, how such initiatives are brought up at the policy level of the agencies, rather than left at personal level in various contexts. Over.
Great. Could you hand it to Robert, because maybe he wants to say something.
Thanks, Klaus. I missed the first part of the presentations, unfortunately, but I heard enough to appreciate what's been achieved here and the vision. I think lots to learn on the IDP side. I love the examples of where we're blending that humanitarian and development. I think a lot of our thinking about engaging the World Bank in our work from the humanitarian side, for some people it's about transferring people from a sort of humanitarian-funded cash system to the World Bank-funded social protection system, and that's not really progress. That's just an accounting exercise, right? So I think I really do appreciate very much when you see these examples of where you're trying to create sort of livelihoods and get. So for me, on the IDP side, solutions are about moving people towards some sense of independence and self-reliance, if not prosperity. That's perhaps too ambitious. But so I think this speaks to what you were discussing. The data obviously is absolutely fundamental. There is some differences. There's lots of similarities between refugees and IDPs under this forcible displacement heading, but there's also some important differences, and I do think, I don't speak of global public goods when we talk of IDPs or trying a sort of win-win deal for governments, because we're talking about their own citizens. We're not, and I'm not kind of willing to go down that road of trying to convince them that they have a responsibility to their citizens. It's a different conversation to start with when you're coming with a problem, a global problem that we're asking a government to help share the burden of, as opposed to the vulnerability of their very own citizens. But lots to learn here. I know I've been following some of these discussions, and David's been also recently briefing me. So I'm listening. We have 16 countries. Philippines is one of our 16 pilot countries, so we need to figure out how we could maybe tap into this elsewhere as well. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. There is a lady there. And then I will just give the floor back to the panel for final comments, please.
Yes, thank you so much for the great panel. My name is Anna, I'm with the International Rescue Committee. So I have a question about the localization in the context of the work of the hubs. You elaborated on the cooperation with the local governments, and that is exciting. Could you please also elaborate a bit more about the lessons and experience of the local civil society, NGOs involvement in the work of the hubs? For example, is there any data sharing with the local initiatives, for example, to inform their response or to inform locally led advocacy initiatives, or maybe also capacity building to support their better targeting? That would be super interesting, also considering localization being a huge cross-cutting topic of the HF's discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have Mama and this lady, I forgot your name, Anna. Who would want to take it?
I'll give the personality question a go. I guess that's the tricky one. I think you're right, for sure. I think with any inception of any new initiatives, of course, a lot of it has to do with the attitudes and the visions on the ground. I like to think, however, what we've been able to achieve now is being streamlined, is being systematized. We are documenting what we're doing. And I think the hope is that this is influencing policy. This is what we're adopting at corporate level as a new way of working. And certainly, as I described it earlier, as really one of the tools that we have. Yes, we have an MOU. We have other policy frameworks that guide us in our approach, from the Global Compact on Refugees to other commitments. We have the call to action, which we've not spoken about today, but also calls to action that really stress investment in certain countries for both the immediate and the medium to long term. But really those initiatives are there to be systematized and to outlast the current management, right, in those locations. That is, of course, critical, that they don't just become pilots and then disappear. So again, I think with some optimism, I like to think that by documenting, recording, showcasing, cross-fertilization of examples, really, there are many operations that are learning from Mauritania. What we heard earlier is happening in Mauritania. There is potential to replicate that elsewhere. I think by doing that, it becomes policy and it becomes more deeply ingrained.
Yeah, we have to. Yeah, I'm trying. I'm being disciplined by the lady down there. I'm very afraid. But Jane, would you say maybe something on Anna's question also?
Absolutely. In full honesty and transparency, we're really focused on WFP and UNHCR for the moment. There are 12 of us. So, our ambition is broad, but we also need to sort of be responsible to the people that we work for. But the idea really is to create systems and solutions that are a public good. So in principle, when we come up with a needs assessment or a joint analysis or a targeting approach, this should be applied by everybody. To the extent that we can pool resources where we don't have enough, let's pool them. Because it's not about WFP food assistance or UNHCR's cash assistance for NFIs. It's about making sure that the right people get what they need. So I think that is also part of the idea, is to open up those discussions to a broader community, but we're not quite there yet. And linked to what Mamar asked, you're right to a degree. The process of iteration is powerful. Getting these teams to talk together and to understand the value of joint action is really interesting. It takes a long time, but once you get them there, a targeting approach isn't one-off. It's a whole new system of programming. And so they need to keep investing in it to keep it running. So we're operational in 13 operations now. It may not sound like a lot, but that's almost 30% of all WFP and UNHCR operations globally, and that's in 2.5 years. So you give us another 5 or 10 years, and we're going to start looking at IDP situations next. So, Robert, this is your invitation. I'm happy to work together. We did a joint assessment in Niger recently, looking at refugees, IDPs, and host communities. We're onto something here. So please, let's connect and see if there are some countries that overlap and whether we can work together.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Work in progress, hoping for scaling up. Not only flicker, but a lot of optimism in the room in the face of a very, very serious global situation. Should we give a hand to the panel and to Elizabeth out there? Yes. And thanks for listening in. Have a nice afternoon.